Hello everybody, and welcome back to the New Mindscape. In the previous few videos, I talked about the debates that exist within the different religious traditions about the perceived corruption of the religious institution that seems to have strayed away from the spirit of its original axial founder, and movements that are trying to go back to that original spirit. So this issue speaks to the paradox of the emergence of religious institutions. Religious institutions have arisen to preserve, protect, and transmit the teachings of the axial figures, such as Buddha or Jesus. But during the course of their development, many religious institutions became completely intertwined with all kinds of political and economic interests. Therefore, the religious institution became inseparable from the web of social, economic, and political power. So in the next few minutes, I'm going to go over, in a very simplified way, I'm going to go over the problem of understanding this dynamic of religious transformation of religious institutions. So what existed prior to the axial age was, we could say, totally localized religion. Each tribe had its own religion, each village had its own gods. In these communities, religious practices were completely inseparable from the customs and culture of the local community. Then the axial figures appeared, such as Jesus, Muhammad, the Buddha, Confucius, Socrates, and so on. Those figures had universal teachings which transcended local concerns and spread beyond a single locality or ethnic group. Their followers came from a variety of backgrounds and communities. They started to acquire a trans-local identity, which was no longer purely local or tribal. So this is what happened, for example, in the Roman Empire. At the time of Jesus, the Roman Empire was a multi-ethnic empire. People of many different ethnicities became Christian. They acquired a new religious identity which transcended their local and ethnic identity. And the same thing happened in the world of Islam. Muhammad lived in Arabia, where people had strong tribal identities and were always at war with each other. But after they followed Muhammad, they acquired a new identity as Muslims, which transcended their tribal affiliations. Within a few centuries, millions of people from Spain to Indonesia had acquired a common transnational Islamic identity, forming the Ummah, the community of Islam. And the same thing could be said of Buddhism in Asia. Even Confucianism in China provided the overarching framework that helped to integrate all the local different regions of China, their local customs, cults, and religious practices throughout the Chinese world. So new religious identities were created around these axial figures and their teachings. But shortly after the death of those religious founders, people had different interpretations of their teachings. So, for example, well, what did Jesus or the Buddha actually say exactly? Who is Jesus anyway? Was he a normal human? Was he God? Was he the Son of God? All kinds of divergences and different understandings arose. And some disciples had deeper understanding and elaborate interpretations. Others had a strong personality. The different understandings started to crystallize around certain leading disciples with different personalities. And the rest of the followers simply went along with the leading disciples near them. But great differences and debates took place between these leading disciples, and sometimes they split into different sects and branches. Around each of these sects, a distinctive organization started to emerge. It might be as simple as different master-disciple lineages, or it could be different monastic communities, or different churches. And so we've seen this happen after the life of Buddha, after the life of Jesus, after the life of Muhammad, and so on. So as the religious community came into being, the religious organization came into being, it needed material resources. Maybe it had just started with just a few disciples sitting around a tree. But after a while, as it grew, it needed a building. Land was needed for the building. The land and building needed to be maintained. All kinds of material issues needed to be dealt with. The community might also need permissions or support from the king. So it needed to establish relationships with the political authority. But the king might favor one sect over another. Or, on the other hand, the king might rely on religious groups for his own support, his own political support and legitimacy. Now, since the religious group had some connection with God, with divine and moral authority, the king might seek the blessing and support from this type of religious authority. So some religious groups said, well, if you support us, we'll say that you're the king because God has anointed you. Or they might say, well, if you don't support us, you'll suffer from the wrath of God. So political associations and relationships between religious and political forces began. Kings started to rely on religious institutions for legitimacy. So religious leaders and institutions gave sacred legitimacy to the ruler, while the ruler could give resources and protection essential to the development of the religious institution. These kinds of alliances emerged in most societies, leading to the creation of a religio-political structure, in which the religious and the political dimensions became hard to separate. This is what happened in most large empires and kingdoms, in different forms, whether in Europe, where the church conferred divine authority on kings, or in China, where Confucianism became the imperial ideology, and where Buddhism also maintained close ties to the state. We have similar configurations that occurred in Islamic and Hindu kingdoms and empires. Some kind of inseparable religio-political structure became the feature of religious organizations and institutions in all kingdoms and empires. Within one political entity, typically, one religion or sect was favored or became dominant to the exclusion of others. So gradually, in different political units, different religions became dominant. So for this reason, a configuration arose in which, in different parts of the world, we would find one dominant religion supported by the state, in which religious institutions were heavily tied with political and economic resources. At the beginning, the teachings of the Buddha, Confucius, Jesus, and Muhammad arose at the margins of the political system. The Buddha was a prince, but he deliberately rejected the political world. Confucius wanted to give advice to rulers, but he actually wandered from one kingdom to another, while no prince fully took to heart his teachings on virtue. Jesus was a mere carpenter in a remote province of the Roman Empire, and was sentenced to death by its governor. Muhammad was but a merchant in an isolated desert oasis, lost in the deserts between the Byzantine and Persian empires, and he was persecuted by the clan and tribal chiefs of his own society. But the universal relevance and transcendence of the teachings of these figures facilitated their spread farther beyond their original social context. Over the centuries, the communities of their followers became deeply embedded into political systems and structures. Political and economic interests accelerated the division of religious communities by sect, by ethnic group, by nation, and by social class. So while these religions had begun as challenges to the conventional social structures, morality, and authority, they ultimately became the very foundation of social convention and tradition, and even of political authority. So we can see how the followers of these axial figures formed new social groups, which often fell back into the same patterns of sacralizing group identity and politics. In their craving for stable identity and structure, human groups have desperately used religion and quasi-religious political and nationalist ideologies to artificially reinforce social hierarchies and boundaries between insiders and outsiders, generating endless wars and ethnic and religious conflicts. Such was the condition of religion in most of the world at the dawn of modernity. And this was the condition which led to religion being deeply criticized, both from the inside and from the outside in modern times. So the big challenge facing religious communities today in our increasingly interdependent world is this: will they help people to transcend their differences, or will they reinforce conflicts and divisions between people? So in modern times, this became the big question about religion. Should religion be reformed? Should it be abolished? Or should it be renewed? And I'll consider these questions in the next series of videos.